Hi, I'm Ben Savello. I was the audio designer for Hauntii, and today I want to talk about the dynamic ambience system in the forest. I'll walk through how it works under the hood in FMOD and Unity, and also talk about the motivations behind my structural and aesthetic decisions. But first, let's give it a quick listen. Okay, so that gives you a good sample of the breadth we cover here. I want to talk about how I approached this, because while I knew from the start that I wanted some kind of dynamic ambience, I needed to figure out dynamic how. What specifically changes? When and how does it change? And beneath all of that is the question, to what end, right? What am I aiming to support with dynamic ambience? So I identified two types of environmental changes to reflect. First is the overall progression of the environment as you move from these bright yellow summery woodlands to the dark orange fungal marshes. This happens on a large scale over the course of the whole area, but the second focus is more moment to moment as you move between densely forested pathways and open clearings, or when you explore beyond the path entirely into the dark. So now we come back to what's our overall goal with dynamic ambience? And the obvious answer is better immersion. But more than that, I wanted to tailor the ambience toward our narrative and gameplay goals. Narratively, we're dealing with themes around fear of the unknown and the impulse to cling to safety and comfort. And so it's important that we can feel the contrast between the safe and cozy refuge, where other characters are trying to convince you to stay, versus the surrounding deep and wild woods that are full of unknowns. In terms of gameplay, Hauntii uses a light and dark mechanic, where if you spend too long in the dark, you get hurt. And because the forest comes early in the game, I wanted the ambience to support this mechanic as players are still getting used to it. Even when you make little spots of light to explore beyond the path, I still wanted players to feel a heightened sense of danger out here. So these were my motivations for the ambience system, which led me to identify these two types of changes for it to reflect. Now the question is how to structure the system to achieve this result, and the two key points that I went for were independent layers for the foliage and different types of wildlife, and a mechanism to trigger those changes that can match closely with the winding curves of the forest pathways. But let's put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. Before I get into the weeds with the implementation, I want to take a moment to talk about the sound design. One of the challenges with Hauntii was finding ways to evoke the feelings of its environments without leaning too much on realism. It's a fragile balance because, on the one hand, we need descriptive detail, but on the other hand, nothing should sound too physical or we lose the sense that we're a ghost in the afterlife. There's a sort of real but also not real quality that I was after. So when I was pulling together insect loops, I noticed that they all gave me slightly different feelings depending on their pitches and density. And I ended up using that all across the forest. By fading freely between these different tonalities in a way, I could shape the emotional resonances of different spaces in subtle ways. When it came to designing birds, I aimed for a wistful quality that's bird-like, but a little off. My process was to use some bird recordings, but also other creatures and props. I slowed them way down, 2 to 5 times slower, and then I used a frequency shifter to pitch them back up. I love frequency shifting, it's so good at finding alternate characters in sounds, but it can be problematic going upwards, giving you kind of a robotic ringing sound. So I used a pretty drastic EQ to cut that ringing out, and then I doused them in reverb. Here's how they turned out. Okay, let's talk about implementation. We'll start with FMOD and work our way over to Unity. In total, the ambience bed is made up of 4 events for foliage, frogs, insects, and creature one-shots. These work independently to suit different contexts around the forest. Inside each event, I used separate parameters to control everything from volume to EQ to spawn rates for one-shots. All of these different parameters would be a lot to manage individually, so I controlled them all with a single master parameter, which switches between a handful of labels and automates the lower parameters accordingly. We can see what this looks like in the insects event. At the top level, there's a nested event. Inside of that are all the different cicada and cricket loops. Each one has its own volume parameter with seek speed, so we can smoothly interpolate between different mixes of these layers. And with a trigger condition and the asynchronous and cut modes turned on, we can ensure that only the audible layers are active at any given time. Now in the parent event, all of those individual volume parameters are automated by the context parameter, so we can define different labels and switch between them to crossfade between presets. And a little piece of housekeeping, for those individual volume parameters, I have exposed recursively via event instruments turned off. Normally, the parent event would look like this, but we want to keep it clear that the user only interfaces with the context parameter. The system takes care of everything else. Building on all of that, let's turn to the creatures event. This works in basically the same way, but instead of continuous loops, we're spawning instances of one-shots. So in addition to automating volume, we also automate the spawn rates for scatterer instruments. I organized the creatures into emotional groups, so we have general birds, which show up all over the forest, and then separately we have growls and crows. That way I can shape the emotional tone in different spaces by controlling the loudness and the frequency of the different types of animals. There's also a special parameter here, a binary switch for allowing woodpeckers. This is for those marshy areas that are all mushroom. There's hardly any trees there, so I removed the foliage sounds and the woodpeckers. That all gives you a solid picture of the FMOD side. Now let's talk about how to control the system in Unity. The first thing we need is a way to trigger ambience changes. I started with box colliders, but I needed something better suited for the curvature of all these winding pathways. So I switched over to splines, which are great because they're easy to draw to fit the curves, but they don't have built-in collision detection, so we need another way to tell when the player enters and exits a region. The solution for that is a bit of vector math called dot product similarity. So first we find the closest point on the spline to the player. From that point we take the normal vector and a vector pointing toward the player. Then we take the dot product, which tells us the cosine of the angle between the vectors. The key here is that this is positive for angles smaller than 90 degrees and negative for larger, so it can tell you if the vectors are pointing on the same side of the curve or not. And we know that the normal vector points outward, for clockwise curves anyway, so comparing it with the player vector tells us which side the player is on. And all this works great, but there are a few quick optimizations we can do to help its performance. First of all, these transitions are meant to be invisible and gradual, so the timing precision can be pretty loose. We only check the player position twice per second instead of every frame. We can also reduce the spline's cache density, so the system has fewer points to sort through. Now we come to organizing these regions in a scene. This is the prefab that controls everything. The object at the top holds the FMOD events. Below, we have the different zones organized in a hierarchy of priority. The lowest priority is the global zone, which is always active. Moving inward, each zone increases in priority, and whichever active zone has the highest priority will set the parameters for the FMOD events. Now, when I say region, I mean an individual spline enclosing a space. A zone is a collection of one or more regions that share the same ambient settings and priority level. So all of these purple regions here belong to the same medium zone. And that means if you're in one of them, we don't need to check the others. Each zone remembers which region you were last seen in, so the next time it looks for you, it starts with that one. Okay, great. So that sums up the gist of the system. In general, I used this for those purposes I mentioned up top, to reflect the broad changes in the environment as you progress, and to create emotional distinctions between things like open clearings and dense woods. but it turned out to be quite a flexible system. And so to wrap up here, I want to show you a couple specific places that had an interesting application. One of those is to do with how the overall map is connected. Scenes in Hauntii are their own self-contained bubbles, connected by portals. This can lead to a kind of disconnected feeling between them, so I used ambience regions to help them feel more related. So here, we're in one of those marshy areas, pretty far away from the brighter part of the forest, but down to the southwest, there's a shortcut that leads back to the main gathering place. I put an ambience region here that blends between the two ambiences, so you can hear how this path is connected to the place it leads to. In that same room, we have this exposed path to the Great Fungal Elder. Our focus here is on the mystical being we're approaching, so I wanted the rest of the forest to fade back into our peripherals, and I did that with lower volume and a touch of reverb. It's subtle, but I think it's even more effective when we come back and hear the rest of the forest come back to the front of our senses. And finally, we have the spot at the end of the forest, where we find our first reflection pool. I wanted the space around the pool to feel sacred, so I removed all of the creature sounds, as if even the birds are sitting in reverent silence. Okay, I think that's a good place to leave off. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know your thoughts or if you have any questions. And until next time, take care.